Okay. So today we're talking a little bit about just kind of copyright stuff as it applies to freelancing. And actually, not that I think I'll even need it, but we can do a screen share just in case. There we go. Um, so yeah, basically talking about copyright as it applies to freelancing. And so first of all, big disclaimer, as per the normal, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just an art schmuck. These are based on my understanding of it, and I've never had any problems with copyright. In general, with copyright stuff, it's better to err on the side of caution. So if you're like not sure, or if you think what you're doing is a little bit gray area, then maybe trend a little more towards the safe side. And then in general, this is like anecdotal and also largely for the US. Copyright is fairly similar around the world. It's actually more similar than contract law, which we talked about before. But it is still a little bit specific to the place that you're working in. So if you're working as a freelancer, just double check the rules for wherever your client is based. Usually that's where it'll come down to because when you're working on a project, if you like that work will be under their IP and under their name. So if there were copyright issues, it would likely be brought up in whatever their country is. For me, I mostly work with US clients, so I'm familiar with US copyright. So the main rule of thumb is, or I guess it's kind of two rules of thumb, at least for the US, it boils down to it needs to be more than 60% original and it needs to be transformative. And that's a little bit vague, and I think it's a little bit intentionally vague because it kind of leaves it open to a case by case basis. But in general, when we're talking about something being transformative, that can include things like it being done in a completely different medium, the story being different, like key elements of the composition or of the I guess it still kind of boils down to story, even if it's an illustration. But key components of the character, of the um, composition, of the whatever being different or told differently or presented differently. So, for example, if you did an ASCII art version of the Mona Lisa, that would not be copyright, actually, for a lot of different reasons. Because I believe Mona Lisa is also past the 100-year. Well, I know it's past, but I don't think that they have any special renewal. That's the other thing is things go into the public domain if they're not renewed after 100 years from creation. So most of the time, if you're pulling reference from old books, old photos, stuff like that, most of the time that stuff is CC0, which means that it's copyright free and you can use it however you want. There was a big hubbub recently about Mickey Mouse. I think if I remember right, and don't quote me on this because they might have found a way to renew it, knowing Disney. But if I remember right, Mickey Mouse went CC0 like as a character fairly recently, meaning like last couple of years, because it had been more than 100 years since the creation of the character. And so I know at least briefly there was a huge uptick in like Mickey Mouse offshoots because the character could no longer be copyrighted. The IP and the character are also kind of different in a lot of cases. So that's something to kind of pay attention to as well. If you're working for a client within an existing IP, but with net new stuff, sometimes that gets a little bit muddy if your client does not own that IP. An example would be like if they were making a game set in the universe of the Frozen movies, that would be something that gets a little muddy that you would want to double check, even if the characters and stuff are original. Um, so yeah, when we're freelancing, most of the time it's not a huge problem. If you're pulling references, and a really common thing or common technique digitally is called sketch bashing, where you'll basically clip. It's almost like collage. You'll basically clip a bunch of different parts of different types of references and kind of mash them together into this composition of original stuff. Stuff like that is generally going to be totally fine. And if you want to make sure that it's absolutely fine, usually the next part of that workflow will be to go back over it with your own line work and like use that as kind of like a loose reference or a rough sketch. And by the time that you've gone in, you've taken your photos, you've skewed them and stretched them and chopped a bunch of different parts together and put different photos together and then traced over it and then painted it, like you're totally fine for copyright. Um, yeah. The only thing that you could run into there, it tends to be with characters. I just a little addendum would be if, let's say you grabbed like, I don't know, a shield or something, and it has a very specific logo or insignia on it that you don't paint out. That can sometimes cause problems just because logos and trademarked icons can cause problems. And actually, Sticks, you were talking recently about the whole like copyright issue with, crap, was it Marathon Games, I think it was. Um, and that's the reason that that's fairly gray area, is because a lot of the specific icons and logos were copied directly. So it wasn't just a style duplication, it also included those. I don't know how that resolved, but I can guarantee that that was the primary like sticking point. Usually if you don't do that, you're fine. Let's see. Other interesting bits and bobs as it applies to freelance artists. I'm sure you know that fonts can be copyrighted. Oftentimes, fonts are free to use, but interestingly enough, at least in the US, there is a kind of workaround, I guess you could say, where essentially you can remake an existing font and it will not be under copyright. And there's actually a lot of people that do this, where they will remake basically the exact same font, call it a slightly different name, maybe change a little bit of the kerning, and release it as its own font under a new copyright. And that is actually fine to do. There's a whole weird backstory about why that is. If you're curious, there's a video on YouTube called Every Font is Free that kind of goes into that a little bit more in detail. Most of the time, it doesn't matter though. In my own personal work, I usually just use free fonts because there's a bajillion fonts out there. And most of the time, if you are looking for something that is so custom that you have to get a custom font for it, you're probably overcomplicating your fonts. Um, so that's kind of a side thing, but something to be aware of. When we're doing things like um, studies, you're basically just directly copying, right? And the reason that studies are fine is because they are not an end product. So if I tried to go in and do a study of like some art by Zeronis and I copied it exactly, and then I said, this is my art, and I tried to sell that, that would be copyright infringement because it's not transformative and it's not more than 60% original. Um, and Zeronis is a modern artist, so his art's not in CC0 territory yet. However, there's nothing wrong with doing studies as long as the end product is not being sold or done as a part of like a commission. Just extra stuff to note, I guess. Basically, the sticking point comes when you either call it your own or try to profit off of it. That's where the copyright people will come in and be like, hey, don't do that. And that's where you can get DMCA'd or whatnot. That's also, interestingly enough, this is like a little side tangent, but on YouTube videos where there's like clips of audio that the system recognizes and you get DMCA'd for, same thing, because that audio is unaltered, it's original, and therefore it's copyright. Um, when you're looking for stuff, if you need to use things directly, so let's say you are doing like a matte painting and you need just a photograph and you're not really planning to alter it, you're just like, I need to use this for a background and then I put a character in front of it, something like that. Usually the best bet is just to look for copyright-free photographs because there's a lot of them. I think Pexels or Pexels is a site where you can find a lot of those. Another one is Unsplash. They will have copyright-free or attribution photographs that you can use without having to worry about it. As another side note, an attribution sorry, what's the word? An attribution license basically means you can use it, but you have to give attribution to the person who made it somewhere. So that means like maybe if you're making it like a game, in the credits you would say photos from X, Y, and Z create artist or photographer or photos from Unsplash or whatnot. And you'll see that in a lot of indie games. Um, if you were using it for like a YouTube thumbnail, you might put it in the tagline below the video, like, stock photography by XYZ. Um, if you were grabbing a photo and trying to put a character in front of it as a painting, there's actually a good argument to be made that that is transformative and more than 60% original. It really boils down to like if it's a landscape shot and you're putting a tiny character in one corner, that's not more than 60%, so you'd run into problems. But a very common anime workflow is to take a photo, blur it a little bit, and then put a character like front and center covering most of that photo. So it's just kind of serving as a general background. And that actually you generally will not run into copyright issues with because it's transformative enough. You're taking it into a completely different medium. Basically, you're taking a photograph and turning it into a painting. And then because your character is covering the majority of that photograph and the photograph itself is altered slightly, so it's like blurred, or maybe you adjust the colors and stuff like that. If it's not really recognizable anymore as the original photograph, or if somebody like just at a glance wouldn't be able to tell that those are the same, you're going to be totally fine. You don't really have to worry about it. It's not necessarily best practice to just pull photos off of Google and do that. And I think you'll find for the most part that the best is just to take your own photos. Not really for copyright reasons, but actually because when you take your own photo, you will have a much better idea of like the character you want to put into that scene and what they're doing. And you can just get a photo at the exact like right angle with the right zoom, with the right lighting, and you just don't have to think about it so hard. A lot of time is lost, especially recently, like just digging through trying to find a reasonable reference photo. And so that's always going to be the gold standards is like just take your own photos. Excuse me. Okay, so that's basically photos. Um, if you're pulling stuff for reference, so if you're like, I need to paint this sword hilt, so you go on Pinterest or Google or something, you pull up a sword hilt and you use that as reference, that's generally going to be just fine as well because you're not just painting the sword, right? If it's a sword like in a scene that a character's holding, your final image is going to be more than 60% original from the image of the sword. And it's going to be transformative because it's not just a picture of a sword. If you do that for like concept art where you're like, okay, this is just a sword, but I'm taking the hilt from a different sword and I'm using that as like direct copy, it gets a little bit muddier. Usually you'll still be fine, especially if you're taking like a photograph of a sword in a museum, for example, because that sword is old past a certain point and it's not copyrighted. And it's also you're taking a photograph and turning it into a painting, so it's transformative. And on top of that, I would hope that if you're designing, like doing concept art, the point of concept art is to come up with net new ideas. So you're taking the hilt, but then I'm assuming you're changing things like the silhouette, the proportions, what the blade looks like, what is dangling off the hilt, stuff like that. So by the end of the process, it's going to be more than 60% original. It's still going to be transformative and you're still going to be fine. One interesting thing, when especially as it pertains to concept art, is like patterns. Most patterns and textures are not going to be copyrighted, but occasionally they will be. And that's basically if you run into a very like iconic or unique pattern that was used for a brand. Very, very specific edge case, but uh, worth mentioning since we're trying to be thorough here. Most of the time, though, if you take like a pattern that you like and you either like warp it in to fit it onto your character or you use it as reference and then paint that pattern, or you start with that pattern and then you draw over it to change it a little bit and then you extend it and then you put it on your character, any of that kind of stuff, you're again running into that like no problems because it's transformative, more than 60% original, and you'll see that a lot in photo bashing and especially texturing if you're doing digital workflows with photos or texture bashing. um, you'll see that a lot where you'll see artists take like photos in museums of old doublets and then like a portion of that sleeve becomes like a border on a banner in a photo or sorry in a painting somewhere, and stuff like that's all going to be totally fine. You don't have to worry about it. Just thinking if there's any other stuff. Art photography art gets a little bit different because when you're looking at photographs that are for artistic purposes, think like fine art photography especially, um, they tend to be a little bit stickier on the copyright, not for like for a lot of reasons, but one of them just being that the people that took them are artists and that is their art. And they're oftentimes going to be telling a story with their lighting and composition and choice of person, like choice of sitter or model and how they're posing them and all of that. And so again, you'll run into problems if you try to take too much of that from that photo. It's fine to take things like color palette or like, oh, they're wearing this interesting flower crown that I really like, or stuff like that. But if you were to take like, let's say it's just a whatever, a shoulders up shot of a model wearing a flower crown with like black paint dripping down their face or something. If you were to take that verbatim and do a painting of it, even if the painting is slightly stylized, that's still technically going to be very gray area, probably bordering on copyright problems. Um, if you take that and you really change it, like maybe it's an anime character and they have, it's like still kind of same composition, but like different lighting, that's better. Still kind of gray area, but you probably won't have issues with it. But if you took, if you changed the angle of the camera, changed the character, maybe it's now an orc, the camera's at a different angle. They're still wearing a flower crown and they still have black paint dripping down their face, but everything else is kind of different. You're not going to run into problems because you can't copyright an idea so much. You kind of have to copyright a specific look. So the idea of a character wearing a flower crown with paint dripping down their face is not something that in and of itself could be copyrighted, but there are some really iconic images where like that image, that specific combination of things in that specific pose with that specific angle is copyrightable. um, and then one other thing when that comes up a lot that I hear is pertaining to fan art and parody, and they're actually two different things. So parody is where you take something and you usually make like a kind of a joke about it. An example is we'll go back to the Mona Lisa, which we've already established that there's not quite the same copyright issues there. But let's assume that actually let me think about like a specific character that would be copyrighted. Let's say that you want to take Legolas from Lord of the Rings and you want to make a play on words where it's legless. So it's Legolas, but he's in a wheelchair and he's lost his legs. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. Basically, the point being that if it is a parody, there is a specific exception for parodies because for parody to work, the character has to be recognizable. Um, but there also has to be something fundamentally different that has to be essentially making either a joke or it's a new spin essentially on the character. So you're not trying to copyright that character that you have made um, as like, oh, this is a totally original character. Instead, you're saying, oh, it's a play on words for Legolas. And there are specific exceptions. This is the one of the areas that varies the most from the US as opposed to other parts of the world. So it's one where you want to just kind of double check. But there is a specific exception for that. The other thing that I see a lot is fan art. And fan art actually generally will fall under copyright. So if you are selling fan art of like arcane characters, for example, and it's the same character, like yes, it's your art and you're posing them in new ways and stuff, usually that actually does fall under copyright. The reason that it's so common and that so many people do it is that smart companies don't really pursue that because that's basically just slapping their hardcore fans in the face. Um, so be aware of that if you're building a business around fan art, that in most cases that is copyrightable and you could get a DMCA to stop. But also in most cases, you will not really be pursued for it, and it comes up a lot less in like freelance work because your clients are going to want their own IP being made. They're not really going to be asking you to do fan art of other stuff. But it's something that comes up enough that I figured I would mention it. There are a couple instances of that where It's come up, and I wish I could remember. I'm sure if you did a little Googling, you could find it. But I did see a couple instances of an artist that is making a lot of money selling like merch of fan art of characters or like ships of different characters from different IPs. And I know that there were some cases brought against them. I don't remember how it resolved. I just remember it was not a super clear-cut case. Because especially when you start to mix different IPs and stuff, it's like there's an argument that that's transformative, especially if it's now like a different style, but it's the character is still recognizable and the character is still copyrighted. So if you're doing your like, I don't know, Tony the Tiger furry art or whatever it may be, just be aware that technically that's probably DMCA-able, but also probably the Kellogg's Corporation is going to let you do your thing. Um, what a weird analogy to end on, but I think that's actually all that I've got on the topic. Just seeing if there's anything else I can think of. That's pretty much broad spectrum, like everything I can think of for it. If in doubt, aim for more original. So if you have a photograph, for example, where you're like, okay, I've used this photo, I'm doing this kind of photo bashing. I'm not sure if I can get away with it because the photo is like it's still you can see a lot of it and it does I'm just concerned. Then the best thing to do is to go out and just take another photo with the same kind of vibes but your own. So if you've got like a photo of a path with like trees on one side and a creek on the other or something, the best thing you can do is just to go out and take one that has basically the same composition and placement but it's your own photo. Then you know for sure you won't have to worry about it. Oh, one other interesting thing, which is very recent, AI stuff. So recently, and I don't know if this has been changed, but the last thing that I had saw was that AI work actually cannot be copyrighted, um, which is interesting. There's a lot of implications there, but the main takeaways being, in theory, you can use AI output without it being copyrighted. I say in theory because there are some instances of AI outputting direct copies of the training data if you give it the right prompt. And that then would be copyright infringement, but you wouldn't actually know, which is a very weird thing that has only recently come up where you'll have an artist who's like, okay, I prompted an AI and then I overpainted the output for it but the AI gave them, without them knowing, like an exact screenshot from one of their training films or something like that. So, as always, be very careful with that because, in theory, you could be getting screwed without knowing it. One thing I will say that AI is very good for is things like textures. So, especially if you're a 3D artist and you're like, I need a tiling seamless wood texture, you're almost never going to run into problems with stuff like that. Um, so extra like food for thought, I guess. Whether you're for or against AI is a separate topic. I have my own thoughts on the matter, but it's worth mentioning just because there are some very specific copyright related things that are just unique to AI. So it was worth mentioning. Um, cool. I think that's everything I got. And now we don't end on the Tony the Tiger. Does anybody have any questions on any of that? I know I basically just rapid fire dumped information while staring at a blank screen. So not the most engaging talk, but hopefully there was a lot of information that was useful in there. So I'll kind of open up the floor for a second. I'm going to go ahead and check the chat as well. Only the Steamboat Willie. So yeah. Is there a recording of last time's event? Yes, there is recordings. I am very behind on editing and uploading them, but I'm hoping to do that either tomorrow or early this upcoming week. So there's going to be a big dump of Ask an Art Director and Open Atelier hitting the server very soon. It'll be Open Atelier will be in the Open Atelier recordings channel right here, and then Ask an Art Director will be in a channel directly below it. Silly says you can buy photography packs for commercial use. The good thing is that those are usually without much editing or manipulation. That's true. Yeah. And especially like on ArtStation, I've bought a lot of reference packs for mostly character poses on ArtStation, and they're very useful. It's kind of hit and miss because oftentimes it's going to be easier to just take your own reference as opposed to trying to figure out like how do I get this photo that like, how do I make my vision fit to this reference or find a reference that fits your vision? That's kind of a separate talk about like design theory and how that works and the design process. But yeah, if you pay for commercial use on like photographs and stuff like that, then of course you don't have to worry. You could even use the photograph straight up. I think in most cases the only qualifying like asterisk there is that you cannot buy a photo for commercial use and then sell that exact same photo in its current thing like at a higher rate. That is another thing, though, that in some places you can do that. It's not easy, but theoretically you could do it. Most of the time, there will be different types of copyright, um, whether you're buying full rights or whether you're buying rights for commercial use, which are two different things. But I'm assuming, since we're artists here, I'm assuming for the most of you, you're not planning to just like buy a reference pack for $5 and then try to resell it for six. Because I mean, I guess you could do that. Maybe that's a great hustle. But I'm guessing that that's not the primary use that most people will be getting out of them here. Oh, any other questions on copyright stuff? You can type or talk, either's fine. All right. If anything else does come up, feel free to mention it. And I'm going to try something a little different. We're going to kill the recording here.